Bismillah Rahman Rahim. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of The Pinnacle. And as we promised last time, we are going to have another meeting with Dr. Chris Hewer. This is the second in a series of meetings in which we are discussing the similarities, commonalities, and also some areas of conflict between the three Abrahamic faiths: Islam, Judaism, and Christianity. Why are we doing this? I believe it is extremely important to do this because interacting with others, understanding with others, appreciating others is extremely important in an Welcome, Dr. Chris Hewer. You were in Australia. How was your trip?
Well, I'm very pleased to say that the travel in both directions went well and that people seemed happy enough with the contributions that I made to conferences and also to speaking in mosques and in Husseinia and such like.
So welcome back, and we hope that you are well rested. And where are you right now? Which city in the UK?
At this moment, I'm actually in the Republic of Ireland and not in the UK, but we're very close neighbours.
Dr. Hewer, before I go to my questions related to theology, I was reading in your profile that you were advisor to the Bishop of Birmingham on interfaith relations. So first and foremost, what is a bishop? What does the Bishop of Birmingham do, and what was your role as his advisor?
You need to understand, first of all, that Birmingham is a city, let's say, of approximately 1 million people, but it has a hugely diverse population. Many people came to Birmingham to work in factories there during the time in the late 50s and 60s. So we have people from all the islands of the Caribbean, we have people from the subcontinent, we have people from several Arab lands, and in recent times we've had Vietnamese people and so on. So a very diverse population. One of the things that makes Birmingham particular is that there is no one minority faith which is dominant. Yes, the Muslims are the largest faith group after the Christians, but there are significant communities of Sikhs and Hindus and Buddhists and Jews and many other minority faith groups too. So the challenge in Birmingham was, how do we together build a society that draws from the good, the insights, the wisdom of all those different faith communities, in order to make a city in which all people, from whatever faith group or from no faith group, should feel not only at home, but also that they could flourish. Now, that was the challenge then in Birmingham. Now, the Church of England understands itself to have a concern for the spiritual well-being of every person who lives in the country, whether they are Christian or not, whether they are a believer or not. So England is literally divided into different dioceses, as we call them, presided over by a bishop, so that no person, no house, let alone a village in the whole of England, is outside of a Church of England parish. Now, this could well mean in parts of Birmingham that I remember one local priest saying to me, I have 30,000 parishioners. The Christians are about 1,500. In other words, all the rest were Muslims. But nevertheless, he felt that he had a spiritual concern for all those people. And it was for me very important that whenever there was a difficulty in the area, whether it be something happening on the streets, whether it was that there was an accident, somebody was taken ill, local Muslim people would come to him and come to the church for help and support, and can you arrange so and so. So this is the relationship then of the Church of England with the whole populace of England. Now, the Bishop of Birmingham then is the Bishop of the Church of England. So it's his responsibility to help to create that sort of society, that sort of relationship with all the people who live in the area. And in that context, then, before my time, there had been appointed a particular post for advisor on interfaith relations. And the task of this post was, first of all, to make good personal relations with all the different faith communities of the city in all their diversity. So if I give one example, we had 2,700 Buddhists in Birmingham at that time, but we had 14 different schools of Buddhism. And they would have considerable differences between them. So my job was, first of all, to make those relationships myself. Secondly, to promote better relationships between those different faith communities and the establishment, whether it be the church, whether it be the government, whether it be local business. Also to promote better relations between the different faith communities, not just between Christians and Muslims, for example, but between Muslims and Sikh and Hindus and Buddhists and Jews and so on. So this was the task that I had as advisor on interfaith relations.
Excellent, very, very enlightening and a very useful task. I've just got someone in the comment section who is saying that Islam, if I can read it out, Islam is not an Abrahamic faith. Abraham and his family never visited Mecca. Okay, Sandeep, maybe we can address that question some other time, because right now I have other questions. So last time we were speaking about the evolution of Christianity over the centuries. When we come to the 11th century, we read and hear about something called the Great Schism within Christianity. So if you could explain to us what the Great Schism was, and I think it happened around the year 1058, what were the circumstances surrounding it, and what was the impact of that? So I think you are still mute.
First of all, we need to go back in history and to see that from the beginning, from the early decades of Christianity, there were different centers which formed sort of units around which local areas gathered. So we can think of Alexandria in Egypt, of Antioch in Asia Minor, as it then was, Jerusalem itself, and later on Constantinople or Byzantium, and then also Rome. So we have then 5 of these major geographical centers, we call them patriarchates, presided over by a patriarch. Now, there are considerable differences in temperament, in life experience, in context, in outlook between these different parts of the countries that surrounded the Mediterranean, which is really what we're talking about here. The idea, first of all, was that all these different patriarchs should be seen as being equal in terms of their relationship to each other, and that they were the heads of the local Christian community. Over time, of course, as politics started to enter into things, Rome begins to become much more important politically than some of these other groups, so that the Patriarch of Rome, later to be called the Pope, the Patriarch of Rome begins to think of himself as being, well, the technical term is used, first amongst equals. So he was the one who, as it were, should preside over the meeting of the patriarchs. And the other patriarchs could see that, well, this was the way that politics had gone. Now, alongside this, then, there were some theological issues that were coming up between the different groups, because, as I say, the culture was different, the languages were different, the way of doing religion, let's say, was different. So both politics and religion brought certain tensions into this relationship. Now, what finally happened was that the Patriarch of Rome wanted to say something more than to be the first amongst equals, and to say instead that he had a universal patriarchate. In other words, the others had smaller territories, but he had the whole global community. Now, this was a kind of tension then that the other patriarchates could not tolerate. They couldn't live with that, because it would have meant that he had jurisdiction over them, not just as the chair of the cabinet when it met, but actually as really rather in a dictatorial role, as one who could direct the entire universal church. That was the kind of political situation then that ended up into this tension, which grows into the Great Schism. Now, there were theological issues as well running alongside that, but eventually in 1054, there was then a separation. And this separation meant that Rome went one way, and all the other patriarchates, who now come under a family name of the Orthodox, they went another way. And Rome, because of the European expansion around the world and so on, becomes by far the largest of all the Christian churches, the Roman Catholic Church, and the Orthodox churches take on in Russia and in Eastern Europe very substantial communities there, but nevertheless, they are really the peoples of the East, Eastern Europe, and to the east around the Mediterranean. So that's the basis of this separation.
And if we fast forward that 500, 600 years later, this is my reading, maybe you can correct me, but as the church, especially in the context of Western Europe or in the case of England, because the church was powerful in the sense that it had territory, it had land, so were political considerations the primary factor in Henry VIII converting to Protestant faith? Or because Henry VIII is definitely the man who has had the greatest influence on Christianity in England, if not in the rest of the world. So will you say that similar political considerations were there, or were there religious overtones to that as well? Because most people say that his conversion was brought about by Anne Boleyn, his wife. So what is your reading there? Were there similar circumstances, political circumstances?
Yes, well, things don't really begin with Henry VIII at all. He's a fairly small figure in this story. Things really begin and take off in Germany with Martin Luther. And Martin Luther was a highly intelligent theologian. He was a Catholic priest. He was a monk. And he comes to a real crisis in his Christianity, in which he says that the church has gone astray. It's gone astray in some minor things, but also in some major things in understanding the deposit of faith that Jesus left, the revelation that he brought. Now, when we talk of the church here, we are talking of the Western church. So that would have been called the Catholic Church, and now from the Reformation onwards, it becomes called more often the Roman Catholic Church. So he sees the need for reform, and this is the origin then of the Reformation. It is first of all a theological, a religious, a spiritual movement. Nobody ever brings about a revolution when they couldn't care less. Revolutions come about when people are deeply, passionately concerned and involved. And this is how it was with Martin Luther, where he was deeply concerned to bring people back to what he would have called the fidelity of the teaching of Jesus. And that is then the origin of the Reformation. Now, in this process, there was quite a lot of interaction between Germany and Britain, for example, as there was in other Northern European countries. This was a time in which religion cannot be separated from the state. So it was the German princes who called the meetings at which the theologians had to debate and discuss and come up with solutions. So state and religion cannot in this sense be separated. And indeed, the great resolution, because there was physical fighting, there was warfare between some of these religious groups in mainland Europe. The resolution of that was that each local prince should have the right to determine the faith of his community. So you would have Catholic princes, you would have Protestant princes, you would have Lutheran princes, and so on. And each prince had that right and responsibility. And of course, in mainland Europe, some of these principalities were very small, and if you didn't like it here, you could always go and move elsewhere. Now, as far as England was concerned, Henry VIII, as the king, as a ruling monarch over the land, would have had that same responsibility for the faith, if you like, the stream of Christianity that became predominant in his land. Now, Henry was a committed Catholic. Indeed, one of the titles which has been borne by Christian monarchs ever since his time was to be Defender of the Faith. And this was a title given to him by the Pope because of the way that he defended the Catholic tradition against some of the elements of Protestantism. However, family life and political life and religious life all coalesced together. And that was because one of the things that kings felt it was crucially important for them to do was to produce a son or more than one son, so that there would be somebody to inherit after him. And his wife bore no sons. And this was for him critical. It was crucial. And so the question was, what should he do? Should he divorce his wife? Now, divorce was completely unacceptable in Christian circles at this time. Or should he take a second wife and become a bigamist? What should he do? And into this tension then came a tension between this part of Henry's life and the Pope and the teaching of Rome. So we have a combination of a need to reform the theological, the spiritual life of the church, with a political element. I am the king and I have to decide on which way we're going, with a family element that said, I need a son and heir. And this eventually ended up with a split coming between Henry and the Pope. And I say that deliberately, rather than between Henry and the Catholic Church, because although Henry leaves the body of the church headed by the Pope, he remains very Catholic in his outlook and in his practice. However, that is the foundation of the Church of England in our own times to be called the Anglican Church.
There is one difference between Christianity and Islam, because when I was growing up, I found it very difficult to understand that a lot of Christians, because in Islam what happens is that the Quran constantly says, read the Quran, try to understand the Quran, reflect the Quran. Now it is for everybody, it's not just for a class. But when we used to read the history of Queen Mary, or of that Reformation era, we found that a lot of people were punished for reading the Bible, for trying to understand the Bible. And I believe Tyndale wrote the Bible, and then he was punished as well. So just help us understand, what was the convention in those days? Why were people being punished? Especially because around that time the printing press had come out, and it was natural that copies of the books will be circulated. So why were people punished in the Christian world for just reading their holy book?
The difficulty wasn't that they were punished for reading the holy book. What happened was that from about the 4th century onwards, the major Western churches all used the Bible translated into Latin. Now, you remember that the Bible is written in Hebrew and Greek, and then it's translated into Latin, but Latin becomes the common language of the Western church. So in the decades or centuries before the Reformation, the scriptures could only be read by educated people, clergy and others, who'd had the kind of education that meant that they could read Latin. Now, what happened at the Reformation was that Martin Luther said, everyone, every Christian, every believer, every person has the right to read their scriptures in a language that they can understand. And so it was Martin Luther, from, let's say, the 1520s onwards, who begins the process of translating the Bible from Latin into English. Into German in his case. Now, the same process then comes about in Britain, where in the 16th century, the Bible is translated into English. Now, still, only a minority of people can read at all in any language. So still, you are opening up the window of accessibility to a wider group than those who could read Latin, certainly, but not to everyone. However, as you will have noticed also in Islam, the difficulty is that whenever you have a translation, all translations are necessarily interpretations. You know, we have the very strong principle that the Quran is only the Quran when it's in Arabic, and that all translations are interpretations. Now, the same is true with the Christian Bible. So you have moved from Hebrew and Greek into Latin, and then into the languages of the people in different countries, German, French, Dutch, English, and so on. Now, once you start opening up those interpretations, because that's what a translation is, then you are open to people slanting the translation in such a way that it supports their theological position. And certainly when we look at English translations of the Quran, we can see that certain passages have been translated in such a way, using English words in such a way, that they reinforce a certain position. So this is naturally the case with translation. Now, it meant that people for the first time were beginning to hear the scriptures, the Bible, because they could be read in church by somebody who could read, and people could hear and understand. Then, of course, they think, I have heard it, therefore I can interpret it. And then we have all the problems of people interpreting things out of context, interpreting verses without knowing the background, the linguistic background in the original languages, without knowing how it all fits together into a faith context. And so we have a splintering. And one of the things that happens in the 16th and 17th centuries is that Protestant Christianity, armed with translations of the Bible, shatters into many, many different groups, because each of these groups is interpreting different parts of the Bible in their own way to suit their own agenda. So this is where the difficulty comes in. Now, it's one thing, for example, for me to translate and to understand and to believe one thing, but if I am going to teach that to other people, if that is judged by the community, whether it be by the ummah, the ulama, or whether it be by the church, to be erroneous, I am then the one who is leading people astray. And therefore, this is the context in which we see that some of those people would be punished, because their interpretation of the scripture was actually leading people away from the truth instead of toward it.
This is so nicely explained by you, and I can actually relate to it that now if we go after the advent of the internet, now if we go to a Quran website, so it's like the polyglot, or it's like a higher version of the polyglot. There's one translation by Picatul, there's one translation by Yunus, there's one, and sometimes those translations can be violently different from each other. One final, I want your view on one final thing from that era and how we relate it to Islam. Imam Ali says in Nahjul Balagha, praising Jesus, he says that Jesus led such a simple life that the floor was always his bed and the sky was always his roof. He never ate ever so much that his belly became full. That is true of John. That is true of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. That's true of all great people. But as time progresses, what we see is that in the name of these great people who had so little, or who could have had a lot, but they connected very little with this world because they were more concerned with the next world. But in their names, huge ecclesiastical bureaucracies are created. One example is Rome. But as we move on and we come to the 20th century, we see the Khalifa of the Ottoman Empire. We see the Sharif of Mecca. Today we see the Wahhab family in Saudi Arabia, and of course a very strong clergy in Iran, led by the Ayatollahs. So when you look at the Muslim world, do you feel that we are moving towards a quasi papal system? And are we now moving in the same direction that Christianity moved in during the Reformation, where there were violent disagreements on interpretation of religion, and then those were not settled peacefully. Those were settled by spilling the blood of people who were very dear to God himself.
You are unfortunately right that many of these disputes were only settled by the sword. And that is one of the great tragedies of Christian history. You are also right to say that over the centuries, the church, churches, plural, became very rich, very comfortable, and there were some people who entered into a luxurious lifestyle. And you know, money, possessions, combined with a high position, the admiration of people, all these things can lead individuals to have too great an assessment of their own importance. Therefore, they begin to think that they are entitled to all these various trappings of power. You know, if so-and-so can have a private jet, why shouldn't I? If so-and-so has to be chauffeur driven around or has to have lovely houses for summer vacation, why shouldn't I? This is always a temptation which is there for human beings. When you add to that in a religious context, in which there is a tendency to say, my way of interpreting things is the only way or the only correct way, then you can enter into an ego-driven situation. Now, it is very true that all our great early religious leaders lived a very simple, indeed an austere life. And it's always noticeable for me, for example, that the prophet is noted to have given away every day all that was put into his hands in that day. He is deliberately not building a fortune for himself. And he dies without, as we would say, a great bank account. However, this sort of deviation from those original times tends to come into religious communities. And that is what happened in Christianity. I was very impressed when the pictures came out of the present Pope going to visit Ayatollah Sistani in Najaf. Because here is someone whose standing within the Shia community is enormous amongst Shia all over the world. And yet he is living a very simple life without the trappings of power and luxurious living and so on. And I'm sure that if we were to ask him, he would say that this is a deliberate move in emulation, yes, of the Prophet, of Imam Ali and so on, but also in a way to stop him getting into that sort of ego-driven world of saying, I am so important. Now, we have seen in the course of the last, let's say, 100 years, vast fortunes of money coming into the hands of various Muslim groups, political groups, religious groups, etc., often through oil and through the exploitation of petrodollars, as we say. And that has had a corrupting influence in the lives of some people. And when you combine that kind of corruption with huge amounts of money and power and political power, and then the ability to promote a certain school within the worldwide ummah, as though that were the only acceptable school, then we have one picture of what's happening in the ummah today.
And of course, now we have come to a situation where there are two powers within the Ummah, and each is trying to peddle its own point of view violently. And let's hope we do not have more destruction than we have had. From my understanding of history, what I understand is that most wars are not fought over disputes. They're actually fought over egos, and I think that if you look at the First World War, in the First World War, on all sides, all the kings were basically descendants of Queen Victoria, but they had the egos, or they had whatever uh, problems with one another, and they tried to settle it in a way, the ramifications of which are being felt in this world till this day, 100 years after that. So let's now go to my next question. The Quran says, relating the book, the story of Mary, how she withdrew from her family to a place in the east, how we sent to her our angel Gabriel, who said, I am a messenger from your Lord to announce the birth of a holy son to you. Many Christians don't know this, but there is an entire chapter in the Quran, chapter 19, which is dedicated to Mary. There is only one woman who is named in the Quran, and that woman has been named 69 times, and that woman is Mary. And the Quran says that we have picked Mary from among all women in the world to be the leader of all women and the purest among all women. How important can Mary be in bringing about better understanding and better interfaith relations, at least between Islam and Christianity?
The importance of Mary, first of all, is that she is the mother. She bore Jesus into the world. And so her importance is drawn from him. Secondly, she is in both faith traditions an archetype of total faith and trust in God. If we think for a moment of the situation of a young girl, a young woman who is pregnant with no marriage, with no man on the scene, then this in those days was even more of a great challenge, a great shock in society than even it is in our own times. So Mary goes through with that duty, that responsibility. She accepts that call from God. So in that sense, she is an archetype. She is a great role model for all believing men and women of total commitment and dedication to whatever God is calling forth in our lives. And sometimes that can be a comfortable thing to which we are called, and sometimes it can be a very uncomfortable thing. Now, for Mary, sociologically, it was a very uncomfortable thing because she was a pregnant, unmarried mother in our common terminology. And of course, the Quran tells us that she had lived really a very pious and privileged life, being sent up to the temple, being allowed to remain as a temple servant and so on, in ways that were quite exceptional in her own time. So she was, in the eyes of her village people, local girl made good, as it were. And then this local girl made good comes back to visit them with baby in arms. And we know the way in which they received her. Now, in this way, then, the absolute center of all religious faith, whether it be Christian or Muslim, is a commitment in belief. That is, I have faith. God has called me to this faith. We know that the Arabic word deen is often mistranslated as religion. It doesn't, of course, mean that at all. What it means is a complete way of life. So the life of faith requires that everything I do and say and am, everything I have, everything I work for, must come under the guidance of God, in submission to the direction of God, the free acceptance that this is what God has called from me. This is what we see in Mary. Her whole life is consumed in her divine vocation to be not just the mother of Jesus, but a role model for faith for all subsequent generations. So in this way, she can be a figure that draws together Christian and Muslim men and women, because we are all bound together by the demand of faith and its total response in our lives.
And it's very nice that you spoke about her her internal virtue, because it's not enough to be related to somebody. It's not enough to be somebody's mother or somebody's daughter. We gain a standing in God's eyes by the virtues that we bring to our lives. So that is a very important thing. Otherwise, Noah's son would have been the most honorable of people in the world, but actually he's not. So speaking about Mary, if we turn to early Islam a little bit, we see that the Prophet ﷺ very emphatically spoke to the Jews, and he tried to establish the position of Mary. And there was no tension in the early years between Islam and Christianity. But that sort of began to change towards the end of the Prophet's life, especially when the Battle of Zad al-Salasil took place 2 years before his death. Why do you think that changed, and what were the reasons behind it? Was it interference from the Byzantine Empire, or was there consternation in the Arabian Peninsula?
Well, we have both things going on here. We've got, as we would say today, global politics. That is tension between empires, the Byzantine Empire, the Sassanid Empire, and so on. And then Islam is coming into that conflict. But we also have the local, the regional, because if you have a large empire on your doorstep, one of the things you can do is to go into an agreement with them, and in that way you have a privileged life. Now, what then happens is that there are some Arab tribes, clans if you like, in the northern part of the Arabian Peninsula who have become we probably should say the mercenaries. They have become the co-fighters with, under the direction of, the Byzantine Empire, because these Arab clans had become Christians at some stage in history. So there was a natural affiliation there. So when we're talking about Arab Christians at this time, it's much more a question of what is their political allegiance rather than what is their religious allegiance. And when we start to see these tensions in the very early years of the battles during the time of the Prophet and soon afterwards, they are the local manifestation of these kind of global problems. Now, we know that the Prophet himself writes to the Roman emperor and writes to many other political leaders to say that I am a prophet sent by God. He has given me guidance for how human life should be lived, and inviting them to get on board and to follow him. to follow the guidance of the Quran. So there's a global issue which is going on there. Christianity then is part of, as it were, the Byzantine self-identity, and they are in the Eastern Mediterranean, and we know that during the lifetime of the Prophet, there are battles, there's a tension between the Persian, the Sassanid Empire, and the Byzantine, the Greek Empire. The Persians, of course, were Zoroastrians at this stage. So religion and politics often are going together, but it's the politics that makes for the tensions, and often then the religion rose in behind them. So that we can find Christians and Muslims who are working together, have a good understanding. It is very significant, I think, that the Prophet actually sends a considerable minority of his early Meccan community to seek refuge in Abyssinia. Why? Because there was a Christian king there. And go and tell them that the Prophet of God has sent you to seek refuge there. So at that level, the level of faith, there is a good deal of interaction, even though there is not by any means complete agreement. But at the political level, then we know that politics raises its head, it causes tension between people, and religion can be brought in as a supporter to those political tensions.
And just one question: if the Christian sources have anything about this after the coming of the governorship of Muawiyah in Sham in Syria, it appears that the Christian tribe of Bani Kalb or Bani Khalib, they become very powerful in the politics of the Islamic Empire, and of course Yazid's mother Masoon comes from there. So what role, if you have read about this, what role did did Bani Khalib play, especially in their interaction with Muawiyah the First?
Well, we know that one of the things that made the early Umayyad Caliphate so powerful and so expansive was that they had a very considerable and efficient army that was centralized and could be sent in to sort out any disputes that were arising within the empire. This was a Syrian army. This is one of the reasons why Damascus becomes the head of the capital of the Umayyad Caliphate. Now, this army had certainly a considerable Christian mercenary element, and groups like the Banu Kalb were brought into that network when they acted as the fighting force for the Umayyad caliphs. In that sense, they have an instrumentality rather than an influence. Now, an influence suggests that you can dictate the way that things happen, whereas an instrumentality is that when things have been decided, you can then help to implement them. And this is what, as far as I understand, this is what these Christian Syriac forces were doing. They were the foot soldiers, if you like. They were the boots on the ground that could actually make the decisions, the policies of the Umayyad Caliphate into realities. There might have been some influence on a personal level in the court of Muawiyah, for example, but that would be an insignificant personal influence. The predominant thing would be that the foot soldiers were the instruments to enact the decisions of the Umayyad caliphs as politicians.
And we in early Islam had, of course, not in the earliest Islam, but in the start of the Umayyad Empire, we had the chance to build a constitutional democracy, because it appears that 2/3 of what was called the Islamic Empire, almost 2/3, if at least more than half, of what was called the Islamic Empire was actually Christian and non-Muslim. And later on in the Ottoman Empire, which was the Turkish Empire, more than half of the population was Arab and non-Turk. So I don't know, when time you have something on hand, when you can build it, and when you lose that, then the impact goes for a long period of time. Coming to morality once again, in today's world, again, unfortunately, a world that has become very material, and where the value of something is judged by how much worldly gain they are able to provide. How does one uphold the values of, most importantly, the thing which is very important to me is humility and honesty, and equality, in a world which is marked by commodification of human relationships? People don't even meet each other these days unless there is a monetary benefit to be gained later on. So how does one, in this environment, a young man, what will you advise him in this world? How can he uphold these virtues of humility, honesty, and equality?
I think the first thing that we need to say is that you do not create virtuous people through trying to impose laws upon them. Virtue comes from the human heart, from the nafs, from the soul of the person. And unless we have, as it were, converted the hearts of people to live in a virtuous, just, humble, just way, a peaceful way, an equitable way, then we will never have justice, equity, and peace. So we need to build up the inner strength of people. And the difficulty is that in a world that is, as you say, determined by money, by consumerism, by capital, and so on, these are all influences that can be brought to bear on young people. Why would you take a just and honorable job for a small salary when you can have a huge salary by being unjust and inequitable? This is the kind of temptation that comes into our world. And indeed, people see that those who are rich and famous often are not earning their money by diligent labor in an upright way. They are earning their money by some sort of subterfuge. So we have real tensions around this question. I think the first thing we have to say is to begin with the understanding of Islam as Din al-Fitra. That is the natural way of life of the human being. And we need to teach and to demonstrate that living an upright and a just and a humble life actually ennobles human dignity. So it is for our benefit as human beings, individually and collectively, to live in this way. And of course, we can justify that by saying, here is the Creator. The Creator knows best how the creation should work. The Creator reveals guidance to the creation. It is then for the creation, that is for us human beings, creatures, to put that into practice. So in this way, we are building humility and equity and peace, justice into the hearts of people, which not only prepares them, as it were, for the life hereafter, but also means that they will live in this life in a just and noble and honorable way. we often say that if only people only took sufficient for their needs, there would be sufficient for everybody to have their needs met. It is the overconsumption. And of course, I live in the Northern Hemisphere. I live in Europe. Huge overconsumption of the good things of the world, of the raw materials of the world, of the power and easy life that affluence brings. And in order that people in the Southern Hemisphere should be able to live any kind of a decent life, the people in the Northern Hemisphere have to live much more simply. And it's very hard to persuade rich, comfortable people to give up their riches and their comfort and to live a simple life instead, so that others simply can live. That's one of our tensions. We're not going to address that with laws. We only can address that in a deeper way by changing the hearts of people.
And you've just hit the nail on the head, because here in Pakistan, every other person I speak to says all our problems are because the laws are not harsh enough. Make harsh laws, make harsh laws. And the moment I try to explain to them, look, actually I think people don't have a proper sense of history. The laws regarding segregation were made in the United States in the 1950s. In 1964, the Civil Rights Bill was passed, but the segregation continued to happen to the 1970s because people's hearts did not change. And but that's absolutely the right thing, that unless and until we change the hearts of the people, nothing will happen. That is a slow process, but that's going to be a very secure plant. That's going to bring long-term changes. So turning to another question, depression. Everyone speaks about depression, and everyone is hit with depression to some extent or another. Some people commit crimes. Others are increasingly turning to meditation. That may be one reason why Buddhism is suddenly becoming Buddhist ethics have suddenly become very popular. So how does meditation differ from prayer? And my religion did not teach me meditation; it taught me prayer. It's always said the power of the prayer. So are they the same thing, or are they different? And if they are different, how is prayer more powerful than meditation?
I think that they are two parts of the same concept, the concept of ibadah. That is, that ibadah is the worship of God with my whole being. So that my economic life, my family life, my social life, all these should be transformed into ibadah, into acts of worship. Now, in order that I may do that, I need certain inner strengths. Prayer is one of the routes to those inner strengths, because prayer, if we think about Salah, for example, it brings us into a moment of repentance before God, of hearing again the guidance of God in the recitation of the Quran, and then of submitting my whole being, my best part, my head, my hands, my feet, my knees, before God, and saying, "You, God, are my God, and I am your obedient servant." Now that is a development process. It brings us into a sense of taqwa. And taqwa I translate as God consciousness. That is, that I should be conscious of God in every moment of my life, in everything that I think and do and say and am, that I stand before God, that God sees me, that I am accountable to God, etc. Taqwa. Now, meditation is also part of that process, because meditation for a Christian or for a Muslim is about quietening my inner self, alerting my, what I might call my listening soul, that I may hear the guidance of God in the depths of my being. You see, often we think as prayer, this is what I do, this is what I say, whereas prayer is actually part of a two-way communication. It is not just me telling God what I want or what God should do, but it's also me hearing from God the way in which I should live, as it were. Now, I'm not hearing this through my ears. I am hearing this in the depth of my being, and meditation is a way of disposing my heart to hear the message, the teaching of God, what God is calling to me today. And what do we think happens in the life of some of our great, our ideal religious leaders? They come to a deep conviction in their heart, this is what I must do. Now, that is the process that all of us as believers are called to. And meditation is a way of softening our hearts to hear that message. But meditation can also be what we call rumination. Now, you know that if you watch a cow has got a series of stomachs and is constantly bringing food back into its mouth from one of the early stomachs to go into a later stomach, and it's re-chewing it. It's going over it again. It's mashing it up. Now, this then is the process of regurgitation. And there is an element of this in meditation too, that I am turning over in my heart before God an issue, a problem, a question that I cannot resolve. What should I do? What does this mean? How should I understand that? And by turning that over deliberately in the sight of God, asking for God's guidance, I am then disposing myself again to hear how God is guiding me there. So meditation can be very important in the prayer practice, in the ibadah of a believer. Now, there's another side to this, because of course, not all people who practice meditation would have an active belief in God, for example. There would be non-theistic Buddhists who are very deeply involved in meditation, but whose whole system does not have a place for what Christians and Muslims would call God. Now, this can be, again, it's a step in a journey, but it can also be a step of escape, because faith requires commitment. It's more than just a feeling of goodness. I feel good because I'm at peace and tranquil. I am released from depression. Faith is an active thing. It requires the total commitment of my life in a spirit of jihad, if you like, a constant struggling in my life to dispose myself to the way of God. So in this way, meditation can have a very positive aspect in the prayer life of the believer.
And you're so right when you you said that prayer is actually a two-way communication, because we are not just telling God, we're also listening from God and what He wants. And when I was listening to you talk, my mind went to the Battle of Karbala, because there both sides were praying, but on Imam Hussein's side, they were talking to God, but also listening to what instructions were being given. Whereas on Yazid's side, there was only one-way communication, and I'm talking to God, but they were not conscious or God conscious enough to know what God wanted of them. And then people who are not God conscious, they end up claiming that God is on their side and God gave them a victory. So that is absolutely correct. There is one human virtue when we're talking about taqwa and we're talking of virtue. There's one human virtue that every religion has preached. Uh, some religions were actually atheistic religions. Like if you take early Buddhism, there was no concept of God in early Buddhism. Later on, it became Mahayana and Hinayana. But every religion spoke about evolution of the soul. In Hinduism, Ram went for a banvas, and when he came from the banvas, then there was an evolution of the soul, and he became a much better being. He was a god, but he became a much better being according to Hindus. So one thing that comes with the evolution of the soul is the ability to forgive. Today, we see sorry, where people are not just unable to forgive others, but they're hell-bent on dehumanizing others. You've done something to me, now I'll make sure I dehumanize you. And when it happens on a big scale, like it is happening in Ukraine or Gaza or Sudan, then people find it very bad. They find it unbearable. But on an individual level, they still go out. If someone hits my car by mistake, I will go out and I will dehumanize him and I will take him to the police station. It was a mistake. Why can't you just forgive him? So this trend of dehumanizing others, especially when you read the history of Karbala and when you see how Hur was forgiven, how can we take lessons from these great figures, Imam Hussein, Jesus Christ, Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam? How important is it to forgive others to make today's world a better world to live in?
I think the example of Hewer is a good one to start with, because here we have someone. You remember when Hewer and his men ride into the camp of Imam Hussein, the Imam says to him, "Do you come as friend or foe?" And he replies, "Well, we do not come as friends." So in other words, there is a predisposition there to say, we are your enemy. Now, the Imam then has to react to this statement. And the way that he reacts is the crucial thing, because he says to his people, "Bring our supply of water, the water that we have gathered for our needs today and tomorrow, and give it to these who have just proclaimed themselves not to be friends. Give it to them, that their humanity may be respected, that they may drink and quench their thirst, that they may wash, and what's more, share it, give it to their horses too." Now, it is this act of goodness that works in the heart of Hewer and changes his life. And ultimately, as we know, Hewer breaks ranks on the day of Ashura and rides to the side of the Imam to seek his forgiveness for what he's done. Now, again, to go back to your earlier example, we might well think that the Imam would actually give him a good kick and say, you know, you're the one who brought us to this place. You're the one who brought us to death. What do you think you're doing now, coming to look for forgiveness? And yet that's exactly what we don't find, because the Imam raises him from the ground, from his humility in seeking forgiveness, allows him to stand upright, as it were, as a human being, back into his nobility and his dignity in his forgiveness. And what's more, he allows him to take the highest possible honor and dignity in the community, that is, to give his life as a martyr, fighting alongside Imam Hussein. Now, here we have a model of divine forgiveness. God's forgiveness does not leave us crippled. It does not say, you are forgiven, but I'm going to kick your legs off from underneath you. It restores human beings to their human dignity. So forgiveness is absolutely central. Now, there are none of us who have lived a perfect life and who therefore do not stand in need of forgiveness and mercy from other people, but also from God. So this brings about then a sense of humility, a sense of my unworthiness and God's unbelievable goodness and greatness, that God can do good to an unworthy person like me. And that changes the whole dynamic. That's the first thing to say. The second thing is that something absolutely dreadful has happened, especially in Western European, especially life in the last century. And that is the way that we have conducted warfare has been to dehumanize the enemy. You know, if you are standing face to face with the soldier of the opposing side, you cannot escape the humanity of that person. You cannot escape that that man has got a wife and children and family back at home. That woman has got her dignity within her own society. And in that sense, however awful it may be to have to engage in that kind of warfare, one cannot ignore the humanity of the other. And we have examples in the Great European War of 1914-1918, in which at times of truce, the humanity broke through and the two armies actually were engaging in football on the battlefield and such like. Now, what happens in the 20th century is that we industrialize the process of killing. We begin with long-range artillery that shoots weaponry much further than we can see. We have then aerial bombardment. We have missiles. In today's warfare, we have drones, so that I can sit in perfect safety and comfort in my own office and 1,000 miles away, direct a drone to blow up your house. Now that dehumanizes by its very nature. I do not see the consequence of the bomb that I drop from my aeroplane, or the missile that I fire, or the drone that I remotely control. And this is a huge problem in our society, because it means that we can do unspeakable things because we don't actually see the humanity of the other. Now, it's even worse than that, because if you think about training soldiers, you are training soldiers to do unspeakable things. You know, if you go to the army recruitment office and they say, why do you come? And you say, because I want to kill people, give me a gun, that's all I want to do in life. You can bet your life you will not be accepted into the army. They don't want lunatics, but they do want people that they can train in order to do things that in our normal state, human beings, we wouldn't do. Killing other people is not a natural thing to do. This is one of the reasons why all our armies recruit young men, 18, 19, 20 years of age, and not 35, 40, 45-year-olds who perhaps might have enough about them to be able to say, I'm not going to do that. That's not right. What we need in our armies are people who will obey orders, even if those orders are very distasteful to them. Now, these are real challenges in our society, in the way that we conduct warfare. And we don't have a solution to this yet. The more and more that we see is the more and more distancing between the perpetrator and the victim of acts of violence. Now, we can go on one step from there. We celebrated or commemorated just 2 or 3 days ago the 75th anniversary of the Geneva Conventions in warfare. These were developed after the Second World War, the 1939-45 war, in which horrendous things had been done. Not only the industrialized killing of the concentration camps in Germany, but the whole development of these long-range weapons and so on. And it was precisely to try to make people remember the humanity of the enemy that the Geneva Conventions were developed. And we have to accept that they are not honored. If you are blowing up a school or a village or whatever in order to kill one individual and incurring the loss of dozens, perhaps hundreds of human lives, and then you dehumanize those people and you say this is collateral damage, then you have succumbed to this tendency of removing the humanity from the enemy. And this, of course, is exactly what's happened, especially in Western warfare in recent decades. If we think about the Vietnam War, what forced American politicians to pull out of Vietnam was the fact that young American men were being brought home every day by the plane load in body bags. They were dead and they had lost their lives. And people of America said, never again should our lives be lost in this kind of way. Now, this brings about the doctrine of asymmetrical warfare, in which I say one of my lives is worth 1,000 of yours. And we see that lived out in various conflicts over the last number of decades. So it's a crucial problem to dehumanize the enemy. And the final thing to say, I often like to remind people of the hadith of the Prophet, which is there in both Sunni and Shia collections, which says, go to any lengths to keep far away from the hudud. In other words, you should struggle to find some reason for what we would today call extenuating circumstances. Why did this person do that? Because of this disposition, these experiences, this social context, whatever it might be. Not to say that they should not be accountable and indeed punished for what they've done, but go to any length to keep far away from the limits, the ultimate punishments. Now, that's exactly the opposite of what we often hear, in which people call for more and more draconian punishments. And people are prepared to go literally for the hudud on the basis of very flimsy evidence, or they take the law into their own hands. We only have to think of some of the instances of mob rule and blasphemy which have come about in various societies. So there's a real danger here of not struggling to live up to the high ideals of God, of our revelations, and of our great teachers and prophets.
And those who do believe in such vigilantism, extreme vigilantism, they have not actually read this hadith, which says that when someone makes a mistake, make 100 excuses for him and forgive him. And when you make a mistake, don't make a single excuse. Prostrate before God and ask for His forgiveness. And the transition that you have spoken about is so right. I remember that at the start of the Great War, when a young British person used to ask his father, why should I fight? He used to get, the probable answer that he got was, that a soldier goes into battle not because he hates those in front of him, but because he loves those behind him. And in the Second World War, it just flipped. When they were attacking Iwo Jima and Okinawa, the generals used to tell them the purpose of going into battle is not to die for your country, but to make sure that the other bastard dies for his. And in the Vietnam War, I want gooks dead on the ground. I want gooks dead on the. It was all about using butchery as a strategy, and butchery is not a strategy. And talking of forgiveness, I remember I was young. I was in A level in 1994, and in England they put up a statue of Bomber Harris, the man who bombed Dresden. And I didn't know much about him at that time, I'll be honest. But the Queen Mother had come to inaugurate it, and Prince Charles, now the King Charles, was also present there. And in the crowd, there was a woman who was an old woman who was weeping, and she was not consolable at all. And she was saying, "People of Dresden, forgive us for that day, but forgive us mainly for this day, when we are celebrating the destruction of Dresden." So that's what I felt. That's what I felt. That lady is actually asking for forgiveness, even though the Germans started it. But for her, it was not an excuse. One excuse that I hear from the Zionists is, who started the Gaza war on the 7th of October? Yes, they started it. But at the end of the day, they are not a democracy. They did not have election. All the people who started were not their representatives. And that's true of Hitler as well. Hitler was a dictator. He started the war in the name of the Germans. That did not mean every German had to be punished for Hitler's crimes. So I'll just go to the last two questions for today, and you can answer them very briefly, because I understand I've taken a lot of your time. Professor Dawkins of Oxford University, I read one of the things that he said, and this is what he said. He said, religion and retribution, devotion and destruction go hand in hand. How does a believer respond to such criticism?
Just let me say one word, first of all, about Bomber Harris. It was 50 years that the people of Britain refused to put up a statue to Bomber Harris because they were ashamed of what they had done. And secondly, the Blitz, the firebombing of Dresden, was deliberately done to create utter terror in the hearts of people. It was a deliberate attack on a civilian population. And that was what the British people could not stomach, as you say, until 50 years later, when the government of that time decided that Bomber Harris should be respected. Now, turning to Professor Dawkins, it is in the nature of Dawkins and other people that they actually define for themselves the concepts that they attack. So you define a concept and you say that's religion, and then you attack it, and therefore you say religion is of no value, or religion is a distortion or a deception or whatever. In other words, they do not take the high ideals of the definition that the believers will give. They create instead their own fiction. Now, in that way, when Dawkins speaks of religion and says, that it brings about destruction, it brings about retribution and so on, he has a point. There is a sense in which religion has been used by people to go out and to destroy and to kill and to savage other people. And if I can use religion to persuade people that the enemy is evil and that I will be doing a godly act and that God will approve and that God will love and reward me for doing this act, then I'm on to a dead winner. That's one of our great problems. Now, that problem we can see extending far wider than just someone like Dawkins, very often engaging in, for example, in Christian-Muslim discussion, we use a term from our faith tradition. The same term is used in the other faith tradition, but is given a quite different definition. So the term prophet in Islam has a very different meaning to the term prophet in the biblical faiths. And so to say, why can't you accept as a Christian that Muhammad was a prophet? Well, the first thing to say is, what's your definition of prophet here? So always, many of our misunderstandings are founded in a lack of clarity of definition as to exactly what it is we're talking about. And that is part of the critique that somebody like Dawkins puts forward. As one of my Muslim professor friends said to me, I actually agree that the kind of God that Dawkins is talking about is a delusion.
All right. We have reached almost 1 hour 30 minutes of this interview, so I will not go any further, and we'll stop here. But you are going for Arba'in very soon. So when you come back and whenever you have the time, I will do one final sitting with you, if it's okay with you, to address the last section. And the topic of that sitting is going to be Karbala, Lessons for Humanity. If that is all right with you, then we can set a date and we can carry on one session. And in that session, we will briefly address the question of evangelical movement. If that's all right with you, sir.
That's fine by me. I'd be very happy to do that. There is still doubt as to whether or not we will actually get in to Iraq because of the tensions in the Middle East area. So hopefully we are going to fly in the next few days, but God knows best whether we will or we won't. But after that period, sometime in September, we can get back together again. But thank you very much for today.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your time. And whenever I approach you, you are so generous with your time, even though you are constantly traveling. May God bless you for this. And I will just close with one sentence from Imam Ali's letter, which says that in this world there are only two kinds of people: one who are your brothers in faith, and others who are your brothers in humanity. So that is a very good starting point for interfaith understanding and bringing about better relations and respect between all people who God created in his image. Thank you very much, Dr. Chris Hewer. May God bless you and have a very safe journey. Allah Hafiz.